London, a city of power, tradition, and secrets. Its skyline is a mixture of ancient landmarks and modern steel towers, each telling a different story of empire, wealth, and ambition. But hidden among these iconic sites is a story that almost reshaped not only London's streets but also the balance of trust between nations. It begins not with a war, not with a speech, but with a building that was meant to be ordinary yet became a symbol of suspicion, fear, and international rivalry. This is the story of China's plan to build its grand embassy in the United Kingdom, and the secrets behind it. The tale starts at the historic Royal Mint site in Tower Hamlets. For centuries, this ground was no stranger to power. Coins were minted here for kings and queens, fortunes created, and the economy of Britain shaped by the very soil. But as time moved on, the Royal Mint closed its operations, and the land became just another piece of London real estate. Yet history has a way of drawing power back to certain places. And when China's eyes turned toward London, it was this very location, the Royal Mint site, that caught their attention. On paper, it looked like a simple plan. China wanted to consolidate its diplomatic presence in the UK. The existing embassy located in Marylebone was small, outdated, and hardly capable of representing the ambitions of the world's second-largest economy. Officials described the need for a bigger, more modern embassy, one that could host thousands of staff, provide cultural facilities, and serve as a symbol of China's growing presence on the global stage. No one could have imagined that such an ordinary development would soon spiral into one of the most controversial diplomatic storms Britain had seen in decades. But behind every blueprint lies a question. Why here, and why now? The Royal Mint, the site, wasn't just another empty plot of land. It was massive, over 700,000 square feet of prime London territory, more than enough space to create what would become China's largest embassy in Europe, larger even than their diplomatic bases in Paris or Berlin. The scale was unprecedented, a fortress-like compound in the heart of Britain's capital, just a stone's throw from the Tower of London, within sight of government buildings, financial hubs, and critical infrastructure. For ordinary Londoners, it might have seemed like just another construction project, but to intelligence experts and security officials, it raised alarm bells. The size, the location, and the timing all pointed to something bigger. Was this simply about diplomacy, or was there something hidden, a deeper purpose behind the walls that would rise? At first, the British government treated the matter cautiously. Diplomacy is delicate, and China is not a country to be challenged lightly. Publicly, the embassy plan was welcomed. Officials spoke of stronger ties, economic cooperation, and the mutual benefits of cultural exchange. But privately, whispers began to spread through the corridors of Whitehall. Was the Royal Mint embassy really a diplomatic mission, or could it be a Trojan horse? To understand the weight of these fears, we must look at the larger context. The year was the mid-2010s. Britain had just begun rethinking its role in the world. After Brexit, the government needed trade deals, foreign investment, and strong partnerships. China, meanwhile, was expanding aggressively on the global stage. From Africa to South America, from ports in Greece to technology in Europe, Beijing was securing influence. The Belt and Road Initiative was reshaping global trade routes, and London was a jewel too valuable to ignore. So when China proposed its massive embassy project, it was more than bricks and mortar. It was a declaration, a statement that Beijing was here, not just to trade, but to stay. For some in Britain, that sounded like progress. For others, it sounded like a threat. In Tower Hamlets, where the Royal Mint site stood, local residents began to hear rumors of the project. Some welcomed the idea, hoping it would bring jobs, investment, and a renewed sense of pride to the historic area. But others were wary. The scale of the compound, the secrecy of the plans, and the sheer presence of such a powerful foreign mission in their neighborhood created unease. Questions arose. What would this embassy mean for local life? Would it become a closed fortress, disconnected from the community? Would protests and surveillance follow? And so the stage was set for a clash that no one expected. What started as a property development turned into a battle of perceptions, a story where every brick seemed to carry political weight. The first layer of secrecy lay in the design itself. Reports described towering walls, expansive courtyards, and heavily fortified structures. To some, it looked less like a diplomatic hub and more like a military compound. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. In a city where embassies often blend into the background, discrete buildings on quiet streets, China's project stood out as a fortress rising from history. British intelligence began to analyze the risks. Could the embassy serve as a hub for surveillance, cyber operations, or intelligence gathering? London, after all, was not just a global financial center, but also home to some of the most sensitive political and military institutions in the West. The idea of a sprawling Chinese compound so close to these assets sparked quiet but intense debates. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, Washington was watching closely. The United States had long warned its allies about the risks of China's expanding influence. From Huawei's 5G networks to Confucius institutes and universities, Washington argued that Beijing often used civilian fronts for strategic gain. The Royal Mint Embassy, they suggested, could be another piece in the puzzle, a place where diplomacy blurred with intelligence, where culture masked control, but Britain was torn. On one hand, it needed China's economic partnership. On the other, it couldn't ignore the growing security concerns. This tug-of-war played out behind closed doors, in cabinet meetings, intelligence briefings, and diplomatic exchanges that the public never saw. Yet cracks began to appear. Local voices grew louder. Community groups in Tower Hamlets started organizing, demanding transparency about the embassy plans. They feared not only security risks but also the transformation of their neighborhood. Tower Hamlets was one of London's most diverse and vibrant boroughs, known for its immigrant communities, bustling markets, and cultural identity. The idea of a walled-off super embassy in the middle of it all felt like an intrusion. Protests followed. Activists stood outside council meetings, holding signs, chanting slogans, and warning that the embassy was not just a building but a symbol of something darker. For them, it was about sovereignty, security, and the right of local people to decide what happened in their streets. Media outlets picked up the story. Headlines spoke of London's new fortress and China's embassy controversy. Analysts debated on television whether Britain had opened its doors too wide to foreign powers. For ordinary viewers, the story became a mixture of fascination and fear. And all the while, China remained firm. Officials insisted that the embassy was a normal diplomatic project, nothing more. They dismissed the fears as paranoia, fueled by anti-China sentiment. To them, the protests and suspicions were obstacles to what should have been a straightforward development. But in international politics, perception is as powerful as fact. And the perception in Britain was shifting fast. By the late 2010s, the embassy project was no longer a quiet plan on paper. It had become a headline issue, a battleground of narratives. Was it about diplomacy or dominance, cooperation or control? The answers depended on who you asked, but one thing was clear: the Royal Mint site was no longer just a piece of land. It was a stage for a global drama. And as shadows deepened over London, new layers of secrecy began to unfold. Intelligence warnings grew sharper, political debates more heated, local opposition more organized. The embassy was becoming a storm, one that would test Britain's resolve, its security, and its relationship with one of the most powerful nations on earth. This was only the beginning. The secrets behind China's embassy plan were just starting to surface, and what lay ahead would shake London in ways few could have predicted. The controversy around the Royal Mint site did not die down. In fact, as months turned into years, it only grew louder, sharper, and more complicated. London had seen embassies rise before, from Russia to the United States, but never had one foreign mission sparked so much resistance, suspicion, and quiet maneuvering behind the scenes. What was it about China's plan that struck such a nerve? To answer that, we need to dig deeper into the second layer of this unfolding story: politics, power, and perception. By the late 2010s, the global mood toward China had shifted dramatically. A decade earlier, Beijing was seen mostly as an economic miracle, a manufacturing giant fueling the world's growth. But now, a darker narrative was emerging. Accusations of human rights abuses in Xinjiang, crackdowns in Hong Kong, aggressive military moves in the South China Sea, all of these who began reshaping the way Western nations looked at China. Suddenly, what had once been seen as a partner was increasingly viewed as a rival. In this climate, the embassy project in London was no longer just an architectural development. It became a symbol, a reflection of Britain's complicated relationship with China. Was Britain too dependent on Chinese money? Was it turning a blind eye to Beijing's behavior abroad just for trade? Or was it standing firm, protecting its sovereignty against foreign pressure? These questions fueled heated debates across Parliament, the media, and the streets of Tower Hamlets. Inside government, officials were divided. Some ministers argued that blocking the embassy would send the wrong signal, potentially damaging trade deals and investment opportunities at a time when Britain badly needed them. They reminded colleagues that China was not just another country. It was a global superpower whose cooperation was essential for everything from climate change to finance. To openly reject the embassy risked provoking Beijing at a delicate moment, but others saw it differently. Intelligence chiefs warned that the embassy's scale was excessive, far beyond what was needed for standard diplomatic work. MI5 raised concerns about surveillance risks, suggesting that the Royal Mint site could become a hub for cyber operations, espionage, and monitoring of dissidents living in Britain. These warnings were not shouted in public but whispered in classified reports circulated among those in power, and yet those whispers were powerful enough to influence the debate. Meanwhile, the people of Tower Hamlets were making their voices heard. Protests grew bigger, louder, and more organized. Local activists accused the government of ignoring them, prioritizing foreign powers over British citizens. Petitions gathered thousands of signatures. Demonstrations outside council offices became regular events. For these residents, the embassy was not just about international politics. It was about their neighborhood, their daily lives, their identity. Not imagine living in a borough defined by diversity, culture, and community spirit. only to be told that the world's most controversial super embassy would be built right on your doorstep. It wasn't just the scale of the project that bothered locals. It was the feeling of being sidelined, of decisions being made far above their heads, in boardrooms and government chambers where ordinary voices carried little weight. The embassy became a lightning rod for deeper frustrations about power, inequality, and accountability. The media, sensing the drama, amplified every detail. Headlines framed the embassy as a fortress, a security risk, a flashpoint in Britain's uneasy dance with China. Nightly news segments replayed footage of protests, showed artists' impressions of the towering embassy compound, and invited experts to debate whether Britain was sleepwalking into a security disaster. Slowly, the public began to absorb a story, and with it, a growing unease about China's intentions. Across the Atlantic, Washington was watching closely. The United States had long been vocal about its distrust of Beijing, warning allies about everything from Huawei's 5G technology to Chinese investment in critical infrastructure. To Washington, the Royal Mint Embassy was another red flag, a potential intelligence hub planted in the heart of a close ally's capital. American diplomats quietly pressed London to reconsider. You cannot ignore the risk, they warned. This is not just about diplomacy. This is about national security. But Britain faced a dilemma. On one side was the United States, its closest ally, urging caution. On the other side was China, a vital trading partner with immense leverage. Choosing one risked alienating the other. It was a balancing act Britain could not escape. And the Royal Mint Embassy was the stage on which this struggle played out. Behind closed doors, negotiations became tense. Officials debated whether to approve planning permissions, how to respond to local opposition, and whether security risks could be managed through oversight. Some suggested compromise, allowing the embassy, but with strict restrictions. Others argued that the only safe option was to stop it entirely. The more they debated, the more the embassy transformed from a construction project into a symbol of Britain's future direction. But while politicians argued, local resistance only grew stronger. Tower Hamlets Council found itself under intense pressure. Public meetings were packed with angry residents demanding answers. Councillors, many of whom represented immigrant and working-class communities, faced a difficult choice: approve the embassy and risk alienating their voters, or reject it and risk angering one of the most powerful governments in the world. The protests outside became more dramatic. Chants of "No Fortress in Tower Hamlets" echoed through the streets. Community leaders framed the embassy as an invasion, a takeover of public space by a foreign power. Cultural organizations worried about censorship, fearing that China's presence would stifle freedom of expression in a borough known for its diversity. Religious leaders, too, raised concerns, pointing to Beijing's treatment of Muslims in Xinjiang and asking why such a government should be welcomed into their community. China, for its part, dismissed the opposition. Officials insisted the embassy was a normal diplomatic project, no different from any other. They accused critics of paranoia, racism, and Cold War thinking. State media outlets painted the protests as fringe movements stirred up by anti-China propaganda. To Beijing, the project was non-negotiable. Britain had agreed, and the embassy would be built. But the cracks in the plan were deepening. Each protest, each newspaper headline, each intelligence warning added fuel to the fire. Slowly, the embassy shifted from a symbol of China's power to a symbol of resistance against it. For many in Britain, it became the physical embodiment of a much larger question: how much influence should Beijing have on British soil? As the years passed, the project remained stalled in a limbo of approvals, objections, and political wrangling. What was meant to be a showcase of friendship had become a case study in mistrust. The Royal Mint site, once chosen for its symbolic history, now stood as a reminder of how history can repeat itself: a foreign power seeking to leave its mark on Britain's capital, and a nation struggling to decide how to respond. And yet, the story was far from over. The embassy had not been built, but the battle lines were drawn. Intelligence agencies were preparing for every possibility. Local activists were planning larger demonstrations. Politicians were sharpening their arguments. And somewhere in the background, Beijing was waiting, watching, calculating its next move. The secrets behind China's embassy plan were still unfolding. And the deeper the world looked, the more it realized that this was not just about one building. It was about trust, sovereignty, and the future of Britain's place in a world increasingly divided between East and West. The Royal Mint site had become a mirror, reflecting not just China's ambitions, but Britain's insecurities. And in that mirror, the people of London could see the outlines of a storm still gathering strength. This was no longer just a controversy, it was a test of politics, a test of community, and ultimately, a test of how much control a nation could retain when global superpowers came knocking at its door. And the answers were only beginning to emerge. By the early 2020s, the debate around China's Grand Embassy plan had spilled far beyond Tower Hamlets. What started as a local planning issue had now become a national story, a story that touched on Britain's foreign policy, its alliances, and its very identity in a post-Brexit world. London was no stranger to foreign embassies. The city had hosted diplomats from every corner of the globe, from the sprawling American mission in Nine Elms to the historic French residence in Kensington. But there was something unsettling about the Royal Mint project. Perhaps it was its sheer scale, dwarfing other embassies. Perhaps it was its timing, arriving at a moment when trust between Britain and China was at one of its lowest points. Or perhaps it was the symbolism, China planting its flag in the shadow of the Tower of London, right at the heart of British history. As the project moved forward, hidden battles played out behind closed doors. Security services had not softened their warnings. Reports circulated suggesting that the embassy's design allowed for advanced surveillance technology, rooftop structures capable of intercepting communications, hidden chambers that could house powerful data systems, even underground networks linking different wings of the compound. Whether these claims were exaggerated or not, they fueled the perception that the embassy was less about diplomacy and more about intelligence. At the same time, pressure was mounting on Britain's leaders. China was investing billions into British infrastructure, from energy to transport. Cancelling or obstructing the embassy could jeopardize these deals. But the political cost of ignoring public anger was just as dangerous, for prime ministers and cabinet ministers alike. The embassy had become a trap. Every decision carried risks, and every risk carried consequences. Within Tower Hamlets, the protests intensified. It was no longer just small rallies or petitions. Entire community groups mobilized. Local families, teachers, business owners, and religious leaders stood side by side, demanding answers. Their voices echoed through council halls. Why here? Why us? Why should our borough become the front line of global politics? The council, feeling the weight of both government pressure and local defiance, grew increasingly hesitant. Each time the planning application returned to the table, tempers flared. Experts were called in to discuss security, urban planning, and public safety. But the heart of the debate was emotional, not technical. Residents simply did not want the embassy, and they felt their government was failing to listen. Meanwhile, British media framed the saga as a clash of civilizations. Commentators described it as the fortress of the East and the heart of the West. Tabloids painted vivid pictures of Londoners living under the shadow of Chinese power, their historic streets overshadowed by a modern fortress. Talk shows debated whether Britain was selling its soul for investment, or whether it was right to stand up to Beijing despite the economic risks. And yet, while the debate raged publicly, another drama unfolded quietly, a diplomatic chess game between London and Beijing. Behind every press release was a negotiation, a calculation. British officials tried to slow the process with endless reviews and conditions, hoping perhaps that delays would soften Beijing's determination. But Chinese diplomats remained firm. To them, this was not just about a building, it was about prestige, about proving that China, as a rising superpower, had every right to establish its grandest embassy on the soil of one of the world's oldest capitals. The more resistance they faced, the more symbolic the project became. For Beijing, cancelling or scaling down the embassy would be seen as a humiliation not just by the British, but by the world. For London, allowing it to go ahead unchecked felt like a capitulation. Thus, the Royal Mint site became more than real estate. It became a battleground of pride, influence, and global perception. On the ground, attention was palpable. Security barriers were erected around the site. Police presence increased during demonstrations. Rumors spread that activists were being monitored, their movements tracked. Whether true or not, the rumors created an atmosphere of fear, as if the embassy project had already cast its shadow over the borough. Then came a turning point. Tower Hamlets Council, facing overwhelming local opposition, took the unprecedented step of rejecting key elements of the planning proposal. It was a stunning decision, celebrated by residents as a victory for the people. Crowds erupted in cheers. Outside council offices, placards waved in the air. For a moment it felt as though democracy had triumphed over global pressure, but victory was not so simple. China immediately condemned the decision, calling it discriminatory and politically motivated. Diplomatic protests were lodged. Editorials in Chinese state media accused Britain of hypocrisy, pointing to its own grand embassies abroad while denying China the same rights. Behind the scenes, trade talks stalled. Investment deals were quietly put on hold. The cost of defiance began to reveal itself. In London, politicians scrambled to control the narrative. Some hailed the council's move as a courageous stand for sovereignty. Others worried it would spark an unnecessary diplomatic rift. Cabinet meetings grew heated, with ministers clashing over how far Britain should go in resisting Beijing. The Prime Minister, caught between two fires, tried to walk a careful line, publicly respecting the council's decision while privately seeking ways to salvage relations. But outside the corridors of power, the people of Tower Hamlets felt a new energy. For years, they had been overlooked, their borough associated with poverty, overcrowding, and neglect. Now they were at the center of a global story. Their voices, once dismissed, were suddenly shaping international headlines. It was a reminder that ordinary citizens could still challenge the agendas of great powers. As the embassy plan stalled, whispers began to spread. Was China planning to retaliate? Would it shift its diplomatic hub to another European capital? Or would it double down, pressuring Britain until the project was revived? Analysts speculated endlessly, each theory feeding the suspense. The embassy was no longer just a building that might rise, was a symbol of the unknown, a storm cloud hanging over the future of UK-China relations. Through it all, one fact became undeniable. The Royal Mint saga had changed the way Britain looked at China. What began as a local planning issue had transformed into a test of trust, sovereignty, and the limits of globalization. Londoners now spoke openly about surveillance, influence, and the dangers of foreign power. Politicians were forced to confront uncomfortable truths, and Beijing, for all its insistence, had learned that its rise on the world stage would not always be met with quiet acceptance. By the time the dust settled, the Royal Mint site was still untouched, a silent monument to unfinished ambitions. Its fate remained uncertain, but its story had already left a mark. It revealed the fragility of Britain's relationship with China. It exposed the tensions between global ambition and local resistance. And it proved that sometimes, the most powerful battles are fought not with armies or weapons, but with voices, protests, and decisions made in council chambers. But as history has shown, unfinished stories have a way of resurfacing. The embassy may have been delayed, but the questions it raised about sovereignty, power, and trust were only growing sharper. And everyone knew that sooner or later the issue would return louder and more urgent than before, because the embassy was never just about bricks and mortar. It was about influence, ideology, and the future of Britain's place in the world. And the world was still watching. The Royal Mint site now stood as a strange monument, an empty space, heavy with tension. For ordinary passers-by, it looked like just another patch of urban London waiting for development. But for those who knew the story, it was something far greater, the most contested piece of land in Britain's modern history. This wasn't just about architecture. It wasn't just about London. It had become a reflection of the changing world order by the mid-2020s. The rivalry between the West and China had grown sharper across Europe. Debates flared about Chinese investments, surveillance, and influence. Countries that once welcomed Beijing's capital now hesitated. Governments grew nervous about allowing Chinese firms to control key infrastructure, from telecommunications to power grids. And in this atmosphere, the embassy plan in London became a symbol of something much larger, a struggle between trust and suspicion. Britain, still searching for its identity after Brexit, found itself torn. On one hand, it needed trade deals. The economy was fragile, energy prices were rising, and investment from abroad seemed more crucial than ever. On the other hand, public opinion had shifted dramatically. The pandemic had raised questions about transparency. The Hong Kong crackdown had shaken faith in China's promises. And the controversies around Huawei had already shown how deeply security concerns ran on. So when ordinary Londoners looked at the proposed embassy, they did not see diplomacy. They saw a fortress. They saw surveillance towers, hidden networks, and the silent reach of a foreign power. The protests that had erupted in Tower Hamlets began spreading further. Activists in other parts of London joined the cause. University students marched alongside retirees. National newspapers ran investigations into the project, uncovering layers of political lobbying and quiet government deals. Even comedians and artists began mocking the idea, turning the embassy into a cultural flashpoint. But behind this rising public resistance, another layer of the story unfolded in secrecy. Intelligence officers, working deep inside Britain's security services, had long raised alarms about espionage risks. The Royal Mint site, so close to financial districts and government offices, was not just any location. It was a vantage point, a place from which communications could be intercepted, patterns could be observed, and influence could be projected. For Britain's spies, the embassy was not just a building, it was a potential weapon. Whispers spread that MI5 and MI6 had provided classified briefings to the Prime Minister, warning that the embassy could compromise national security in ways the public might never fully understand. According to some insiders, these warnings played a crucial role in shaping the government's increasingly cautious stance. Meanwhile, Chinese diplomats pressed harder than ever. They argued that Britain was discriminating against them, treating China unfairly compared to other nations. They reminded British officials of the billions already invested into railways, nuclear plants, and real estate. They hinted at retaliation, not military, but economic. London risked losing access to crucial markets if it continued to resist. The stage was set for a diplomatic showdown. Then came a dramatic twist. Tower Hamlets Council, standing firm on its rejection, became a symbol of grassroots democracy defying global superpowers. Residents who once felt ignored by Westminster now found themselves at the center of the storm. Their voices, amplified by media, became impossible for national leaders to silence. The embassy project had united a fractured community. In the crowded streets of East London, where diversity was woven into every shop front and market stall, people of all backgrounds found common cause. Muslims, Christians, atheists, long-time residents, and recent migrants stood shoulder to shoulder. They weren't protesting against China as a people, they were protesting against the imposition of power without consent. That unity gave the story its moral weight. Internationally, reactions poured in. In Washington, American officials quietly praised Britain's resistance, seeing it as part of a broader Western effort to check China's rise. In Brussels, European leaders debated whether similar embassy projects should face greater scrutiny. In Beijing, the tone hardened. Chinese media framed Britain as hypocritical and weak, accusing it of bowing to American influence, and all the while, the Royal Mint site remained untouched, its silence louder than any speech but history has. A way of transforming silence into symbolism. For many Londoners, the empty site became a reminder that even the most powerful governments could be held accountable. For Beijing, it was a bruise to national pride. For Britain, it was an unresolved question hanging over its future foreign policy. The embassy saga had revealed deep truths. It showed that in a globalized world, local communities still mattered. It proved that small acts of defiance could ripple outward, shaking the foundations of diplomacy. And it highlighted the fragile balance between security and openness, sovereignty and globalization. Yet the story does not end with rejection, because every great power plays a long game, even as Britain celebrated the Council's decision. Analysts warned that China was unlikely to give up. The embassy, they said, was not just about London. It was about projecting an image to the world. If not at the Royal Mint site, then somewhere else, China would continue its mission. The question was not whether the embassy would rise, but when, and how. And so, Londoners live with the uncertainty. Will the Royal Mint remain a monument to defiance, or will it someday be transformed, its walls rising high, its red flag flying boldly beside the Thames? Only time will answer. But one thing is certain. The debate has already reshaped Britain. It has forced the country to confront the price of its alliances. It has shown how much weight ordinary citizens can carry when they speak together. And it has revealed once again that the fiercest battles of the modern age are not always fought on distant battlefields but on city streets, in council chambers, and in the quiet shadows of urban land. The Royal Mint Embassy was never just a plan, it was a mirror. A mirror reflecting the fears, hopes, and struggles of a nation at a crossroads. And as the world watched London, one truth became clear. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of something far larger. Because embassies are not simply buildings, they are statements. And China's statement, whether delayed or denied, will one day demand to be heard. And when that day comes, London will once again find itself at the center of history.